Minnesota, North Woods, August 1887. The air was thick with the drone of insects and the scent of pine, but the sound that drew the eye was the rhythmic scrape and crunch of Johan Eriksson's shovel. He was not clearing land or digging a root cellar. He was shoveling black dust into a wheelbarrow, a fine, gritty powder that clung to the sweat on his arms and face, turning him into a soot-streaked apparition. The dust came from a great, cooled mound of earth and charcoal, the remnants of a multi-day burn he had meticulously managed. His neighbors watched from a distance. They saw a man collecting waste, the fine, unsellable grit that was the byproduct of making charcoal for the smiths and foundries. He was hauling this black refuse to his new cabin site, a structure that was itself a source of confused muttering. It had two walls, an inner and an outer frame of rough-sawn pine, separated by a 6-inch gap. It looked like he was building a box to put inside another box. Now he was filling that gap with worthless dust. The sight was so peculiar it stopped men on the trail. They leaned on their axes, they squinted from their wagons, and they all came to the same conclusion. The quiet Swede, the newcomer who kept to himself, had finally been broken by the isolation of the deep woods. He was building his own tomb, a dusty, flammable coffin for his family. They called it Eriksson's dustbin. What did this quiet immigrant, a man with calloused hands and a knowledge forged in the ancient forests of another continent, understand about heat and cold that every seasoned timber-right and hardened frontiersman in the territory had missed? He was packing his walls with the black heart of a dead fire, an act that seemed like pure madness, but that madness would be tested by the coldest winter in living memory, and the answer he provided would change how life was lived in the frozen North. If you want to understand how forgotten wisdom can outperform modern assumptions, subscribe to this channel right now, because this story is a masterclass in seeing what others refuse to. The problem in this part of Minnesota was not survival. It was the quality of that survival. Life was a 9-month battle against the cold, punctuated by 3 fleeting months of battling mosquitoes. The cold was the true enemy, a relentless, creeping siege that began in October and did not release its grip until April. It was a physical presence, a predator that stalked the clearings and pressed against the walls of every cabin. The settlers were not fools. They were masters of an established craft. They built their cabins according to a hard-won tradition. They felled the largest pines they could manage, hewed them square with broadexes until their shoulders ached, and notched them with a skill that left joints tight enough to turn a knife blade. They chinked the gaps with a mixture of moss, clay, and horsehair, a laborious process that had to be repeated every autumn as the great logs settled and shifted. These cabins were fortresses of timber. They were monuments to human labor, designed to blunt the force of the wind and bear the weight of impossible snows. And yet they failed in their most fundamental purpose. They could not hold heat. The sheer thermal mass of the logs, dense and solid, acted as a direct bridge to the outside world. The cold didn't just stay outside. The logs invited it in, conducting it through the timber until the interior walls wept with a film of frost. Life inside was a constant, exhausting chore. The stoves, great cast-iron beasts hungry for fuel, had to be fed around the clock. The heat they produced was fierce and immediate, roasting anyone who stood near while leaving the far corners of the single room frigid. A bucket of water placed 10 feet from the stove would be skimmed with ice by morning. Ink froze in its wells. A loaf of bread left on a shelf would become a frozen brick. The consumption of firewood was terrifying. A family needed to cut, split, and stack a mountain of cordwood, 20, sometimes 30 cords, just to survive the winter. The sound of the axe was the heartbeat of the settlement, a constant drum of preparation and fear. To run out of wood was to die. The work was endless, consuming the brief summer and autumn, leaving men bone-weary before the first snows even fell. The air inside these cabins was heavy and damp. The moisture from cooking, washing, and simply breathing had nowhere to go. It condensed on the cold logs, creating a slick of moisture that encouraged mold and mildew. Blankets felt perpetually clammy. The chill sank into muscles and bones, leading to racking coughs that echoed in the small spaces, a grim winter chorus. This was the accepted reality, the price of admission for a piece of land to call one's own. Johan Eriksson knew this reality, but he did not accept it. He had come from the deep forests of Småland in Sweden, a land of stone and timber that bred a different kind of thinking. He was not a trained engineer or a man of letters. He was a charcoal burner, a collare, a profession that was as much an art as a trade. For generations, his family had managed the great charcoal mounds, the Kolmila, slowly transforming wood into the pure carbon that fueled the Swedish ironworks. The life of a collare was one of profound isolation and observation. Weeks were spent alone in the forest, tending the mound, reading the color of the smoke, listening to the sounds of the slow, subterranean burn. In that solitude, Johan had learned things that were not written in books. He had learned about the secret life of wood, of fire, and of heat. He knew the properties of charcoal better than any man in the territory. He knew its astonishing lightness. He knew its resistance to rot and insects. But most importantly, he knew its structure. He had spent countless hours handling the finished product, and he understood, in a practical, tactile way, that it was not truly solid. It was a black sponge, a matrix of countless microscopic air pockets, the ghosts of the cells that had once made up the living wood. And he knew the properties of charcoal dust. To most, it was a nuisance, a messy waste product. But Johan had paid attention. He had noticed how a pile of charcoal fines left out in the damp forest air would form a dry crust while the ground beneath it remained moist. He had seen how snow would melt around a bag of charcoal pieces, but would linger for days atop a pile of the dust. His hands told him the story. The dust did not feel cold to the touch, not like a rock or a piece of iron did. It felt inert, disconnected from the ambient temperature. He was a man who carried a different library of knowledge in his head. While his neighbors saw a log as a solid barrier, Johan saw it as a frozen highway for the cold. While they saw an empty space as wasted, he saw it as an opportunity. He was not building from a blueprint of tradition, but from a deep, intuitive understanding of a material nobody else valued. His madness was simply the application of knowledge they did not possess. He was not trying to build a thicker wall. He was trying to build a smarter one. The construction of his cabin began like any other. He felled the trees, squared the logs, and raised the outer frame. It was good, solid work, and for a time he earned the grudging respect of his neighbors. The man was quiet, but his axe bit deep, and his joints were clean. Then he began building the second wall. Inside the first, he erected a lighter frame of 6-inch studs, creating a continuous, hollow cavity that ran around the entire perimeter of the cabin. This was the first act that caused widespread confusion. He was sacrificing precious interior space, a commodity more valuable than gold in a frontier cabin. He was doubling the work, doubling the lumber for a purpose nobody could fathom. Silas Croft was the first to approach him directly. Croft was the region's most respected builder, a man whose opinion carried the weight of authority. He had built the church, the trading post, and nearly half the homes in the settlement. His work was known for its durability and precision. He approached Johann not with malice, but with a genuine paternalistic concern. He found Johann nailing the interior sheathing into place, leaving the top open. "Eriksson," Silas began, his voice calm and reasonable, "I've been watching your method here. It's a fine frame. But this gap, what's the intention?" Johann paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. "For insulation," he said simply. His English was clear but accented, each word chosen with care. Silas nodded slowly, as if considering a novel but flawed idea. "An air gap. I've seen it tried. It doesn't work, son, not in this cold. The air in that cavity will grow as cold as the air outside. You're just building a thin inner wall against a box of pure January cold. You'll have frost on both sides of it." "I will fill the gap," Johann replied, gesturing with his hammer toward the great pile of black dust nearby. Silas Croft stared at the charcoal mound, then back at Johann. He blinked, certain he had misunderstood. With that? With charcoal dust? The question was quiet, laced with disbelief. "Yes," Johann said. That was when Silas's concern sharpened into a technical critique. He was no longer a neighbor offering advice. He was an expert identifying a catastrophic failure in design. "Eriksson, you cannot do that. Let me explain what will happen. That dust will settle, leaving voids at the top, but that's the least of your worries. The warmth and moisture from inside your cabin will hit that cold inner wall. It will condense. Water will run down and soak that dust." He stepped closer, pointing a thick finger at the wall cavity. "That black powder will become a black mud. It will freeze solid in winter, turning your wall into a solid block of ice. And in the spring thaw, it will be a wet, rotting mass. It will draw mold. It will eat your timbers from the inside out. Your house will be a ruin within 2 years. You are building a swamp inside your walls." It was a powerful, logical argument, grounded in the known physics of cold and condensation. Every man at the trading post who heard Silas recount the conversation nodded in agreement. Croft's reasoning was sound. It was common knowledge. "It will be dry," was all Johann said in response. He did not argue or defend. He simply stated his belief. Silas Croft shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "And what about fire? A spark gets into that wall, and it will smolder for days. You won't even know it's happening until the whole structure is consumed. You're building a tinderbox for your wife and children." "It will not burn," Johann said, his voice flat, unwavering. The conversation was over. Silas walked away, convinced the man was a fool, but now a dangerous one. The community's murmuring turned to open mockery. The cabin was no longer just a curiosity. It was Eriksson's folly, or the charcoal box. Men would joke that Johann was so determined to stay warm, he was planning to burn his house down from the inside. Women would cast worried glances at Johann's wife, Anna, pitying her for being married to a man so stubborn he would endanger his own family. Undeterred, Johann continued his work. The process was grueling. First, he had to produce the charcoal itself, a task that took nearly a week of constant supervision. He built a massive conical mound of pine, covered it with earth and sod, and lit a slow oxygen-starved fire at its core. For days he tended it, sleeping in a small lean-to nearby, his life governed by the plume of smoke rising from the mound. When the burn was complete and the mound had cooled, he and Anna began the arduous task of sifting. They built a large screen of wire mesh. They shoveled the charcoal onto it, separating the larger sellable chunks from the fine dust and grit that fell through. This was the material he wanted. He amassed a huge pile of it, a black dune of what everyone else considered waste. Then came the filling. It was slow, dusty work. He would nail up a few more feet of the interior sheathing, then climb a ladder and pour the charcoal dust into the cavity, using a long pole to tamp it down, ensuring it settled into every crevice. The black powder was pervasive. It coated everything. Anna worked alongside him, her face and clothes as black as his, the two of them a silent, determined team against the rising tide of public opinion. He paid meticulous attention to the details. He packed the dust tightly, using the pole to feel for any voids. He worked his way up the walls, section by section, until the entire 6-inch gap from the foundation sill to the roof plates was a solid, densely packed mass of pure carbon. He even built a similar double-layered structure for the floor, filling the joist space below with a foot of the same black dust before laying the floorboards. The ceiling was packed in the same way. He was building a cocoon. The system, as Johann understood it, was a complete thermal break. The millions of tiny air pockets trapped within the granular structure of the charcoal dust would resist the transfer of heat. It was not a barrier of solid mass like a log wall, but a barrier of trapped, unmoving air. The sheer volume of tiny, isolated spaces would make it nearly impossible for the exterior cold to conduct its way to the interior wall. Furthermore, he knew something about charcoal that Silas Croft, for all his expertise with timber, did not. He knew it was hygroscopic. It actively attracted and held water molecules from the air. Any moisture that tried to condense in the wall would not pool and cause rot. It would be absorbed and held by the charcoal itself, effectively keeping the wooden structure dry. The swamp Silas had predicted was an impossibility. The charcoal was a desiccant, a guardian against the very dampness Silas feared. His walls would breathe. He finished the cabin in late October, just as the first cold winds began to scour the landscape. From the outside, it looked much like any other cabin, albeit slightly bulkier. But those who had watched its construction knew it was different. It was a house built on a principle of foolishness, a monument to one man's stubborn refusal to listen to reason. It was Erickson's dustbin, and the entire settlement was waiting for winter to teach him his lesson. November came with a hard frost that did not relent. The ground froze solid. The days grew short and gray. By early December, the first blizzard swept in from the northwest, burying the landscape in 2 feet of snow and locking the settlement in the grip of true winter. The routine of suffering began. Then came the week that would enter local legend. It began not with a storm, but with an unnatural stillness. The sky cleared to a brilliant, crystalline blue, and the temperature began to plummet. It was a cold that felt different, dry, sharp, and invasive. The air was so frigid it hurt to breathe. The thermometer at the trading post became the center of a grim, anxious ritual. At dawn on the first day, it read 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was 22 below. The old-timers shook their heads, their breath crystallizing in clouds around them. They had never seen numbers like this before Christmas. The second day, the temperature did not rise above 15 below. The wind picked up, a razor-edged gale that drove the cold through the tiniest cracks in the cabin walls. The chinking, frozen solid contracted and pulled away from the logs, opening up dozens of new fissures for the wind to exploit. The sound of the wind was a high, mournful shriek, the voice of the predator outside. Inside the cabins, the battle for warmth became desperate. Families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their backs to the roaring stoves. The heat radiated only a few feet before the killing cold of the room swallowed it whole. A rime of frost, thick and feathery, grew on the interior walls, tracing the patterns of the logs. It crept across the floor from the corners, a visible manifestation of the siege. The consumption of firewood became frantic. Men who had prided themselves on their winter preparations now looked at their woodpiles with a growing sense of panic. They were burning through a week's worth of fuel in 2 days. The rhythmic chunk of the axe was replaced by a frantic, splintering crash as men began to break up unused furniture, old crates, anything that would burn to feed the insatiable hunger of the stoves. Silas Croft's cabin, considered the finest in the settlement, was failing. For all its tight joints and massive timbers, it was bleeding heat into the Arctic air. He and his wife worked in shifts, one sleeping while the other fed the stove, a constant, exhausting vigil. The frost was a half-inch thick on their north wall. Their children, bundled in so many layers they could barely move, cried from the cold that seeped up through the floorboards. On the morning of the third day, the thermometer at the post was found, with its mercury frozen solid in the bulb. It was later estimated the temperature had dropped below 40 degrees below zero. This was no longer a harsh winter. This was a catastrophic event, an Arctic wave that threatened to wipe out the entire settlement. Livestock froze to death in their barns. The river ice boomed like cannon fire as it contracted. The very trees in the forest groaned and split open with the cold. In the midst of his own struggle, a thought began to gnaw at Silas Croft. It was a thought born of fear and a flicker of professional guilt. Ericsson, the fool Swede with his dust-filled walls. He pictured the family, the quiet man, his wife, their 2 small children, in that flimsy-looking box. He imagined their fire would have gone out, their cabin nothing more than a frozen tomb. The mockery of the summer now felt like a lead weight in his stomach. He had warned the man, yes, but he had also stood by and let him proceed. By midday, the worry had become an unbearable compulsion. He had to know. He had to see. He told his wife he was going to check on the Ericssons. She pleaded with him not to go. The trip was too dangerous. But he was resolute. He bundled himself in layers of wool and canvas, pulled a fur hat down over his ears, and wrapped a scarf over his face until only his eyes were visible. He stepped outside into a world of brutal, silent cold. Before he left, he glanced at his woodpile. The 3 neat cords he had stacked by the door for immediate use were nearly gone. 3 days had consumed what should have lasted 3 weeks. This fact more than the frozen thermometer, terrified him. The cold was not just an enemy. It was an engine of consumption, devouring their fuel, their work, their very future. It was this thought that propelled him onto the trail. It's in moments of extreme crisis that the truth is often revealed. If you've ever faced a situation that made you question everything you thought you knew, hit that like button right now, because Silas Croft was about to have his entire world turned upside down. The journey to Johann's cabin was only half a mile, but it was the most harrowing half-mile of Silas Croft's life. The air was a physical assault. Each inhalation was like breathing in powdered glass. His eyelashes, wet from the brief exposure of his eyes, quickly froze together, and he had to pry them apart with a gloved finger. The snow under his boots did not crunch. It shrieked, a high-pitched, alien sound he had never heard before. He walked through a landscape of suspended animation. The forest was utterly silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even the whisper of the wind. It was a silence that felt heavy, absolute. The sun was a pale, impotent disk in the white sky, offering light but no warmth. He felt small and fragile, an insignificant trespasser in a world that was actively hostile to life. He kept his head down, focusing on the trail, his mind filled with grim scenarios of what he would find. A frozen family, a dead fire, a tragic monument to stubborn pride. When he saw the cabin, he saw no signs of life. There was no column of smoke rising from the chimney. This was the final confirmation of his fears. A fire that went out on a day like this did not get relit. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and grim responsibility. He reached the door and hammered on it with his mittened hand, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. He waited. Nothing. He hammered again, harder this time, shouting Johann's name. His voice was thin and weak in the vast cold. He was about to put his shoulder to the door to force his way in and face the tragedy when he heard the sound of the latch drawing back. The door swung inward. It was not a wave of warmth that hit him. It was a physical wall, a solid, palpable presence of dry, radiant heat that washed over his frozen body, so shocking in its intensity that he staggered back a step. It was a heat that carried the scent of baking bread and warm pine, the smell of a normal, comfortable home. He stood there, dumbfounded, on the threshold between two separate worlds. Johann Eriksson stood in the doorway, holding his young daughter on his hip. He was in his shirt sleeves. His face, illuminated by the warm light from within, showed only mild surprise at seeing his visitor. Beyond him, Silas saw a scene of impossible domesticity. Johann's son, no more than 5 years old, was sitting on the wooden floor, playing with a carved toy horse. He was barefoot. Steam rose from a kettle on the stove, but the stove door was shut, and its damper was turned nearly closed. There was no roaring fire, only the gentle, efficient hum of a slow burn. Anna, Johann's wife, was kneading dough on a flour-dusted table, her sleeves also rolled up to her elbows. And the walls were bare wood, clean and dry. There was not a single speck of frost on them, not anywhere. Silas Croft stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and the brutal world of the Arctic cold simply ceased to exist. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his beard a solid mass of ice, and stared. He was a master builder, a man who understood the language of stress and load, of heat and cold, and what he was seeing was impossible. It violated every principle of construction he had ever known. "Johann," he began, his voice hoarse, "your fire, I saw no smoke." Johann shrugged, a simple, non-boastful gesture. "The fire is very low. It does not need much wood. The house holds the heat." He said it as a simple statement of fact. Silas's expert mind began to race, trying to deconstruct the miracle he was witnessing. He was an investigator now, driven by a desperate need to understand. He walked slowly around the single room, his eyes taking in every detail. He looked at the windows. They were simple panes of glass, yet they were clear, with only the slightest bit of condensation at the very bottom edge, not the thick sheets of ice that covered his own. He turned his attention to the wood box next to the stove. It was an ordinary crate, perhaps 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was about 3/4 full of split birch. He gestured toward it. "How long has that wood been in there?" "I filled it yesterday morning," Johann answered. The words did not compute. Silas stared at the wood box, then back at Johann. He did the mental math, his mind reeling. Johann had used perhaps 1/4 of a small crate of wood in 24 hours, during the coldest day in the territory's history. Silas, in his own superior cabin, had burned through nearly a full cord in the same amount of time. The difference was not a matter of degrees, it was a difference of magnitude. It was the difference between a leaky bucket and a sealed barrel. The numbers were undeniable, but they were still abstract. Silas needed something tactile, something his own senses could verify. He walked to the north wall, the wall that faced the full, unrelenting force of the Arctic wind. In his own home, this wall was a sheet of ice, a surface so cold it felt like it was actively sucking the life out of the room. He reached out a hand, hesitant, half expecting the searing cold he knew should be there. He pressed his palm flat against the interior pine boards, and he felt nothing. It was not warm, not like the stove, but it was not cold. It felt completely neutral, the same temperature as the air in the room. There was no draft, no chill, no hint of the 40 below zero apocalypse raging just 8 inches away. It was just a wall, a calm, stable, temperate surface. He pressed harder, as if trying to force the truth through his skin. It was real. He turned back to face Johann, his face a mask of awe and shattered certainty. All his experience, all his hard-won knowledge, all the derisive jokes and confident pronouncements he had made, they all crumbled to dust in that single, revelatory moment. He had come expecting to be a savior. Instead, he found he was a student. He looked from the comfortable, safe children to the placid, dry walls, to the small, barely used woodpile. He saw not just a different building method, but a different philosophy. Johann had not fought the cold. He had not built a fortress to withstand a siege. He had built a vessel that was simply oblivious to it. He had created a pocket of summer in the heart of a killing winter. Silas Croft, the most respected builder in the region, a man whose word was law when it came to timber and trusses, looked at the quiet Swedish immigrant and uttered the 3 hardest words in the English language for a man of his standing. "I was wrong." His voice was quiet, stripped of all its former authority. "Completely wrong. This is not a house. It is a miracle. Johann, you must show me how this works." The great cold snap, the event that came to be known as the white stillness, broke on the 5th day. The temperature slowly climbed, and by the end of the week it had returned to the normal, merely brutal levels of a Minnesota winter. The settlement emerged from its hibernation, and the stories began to circulate. Stories of loss, of cattle frozen solid, of families who had burned everything they owned to stay alive. But another story began to spread, a story that started at the trading post, told not by the quiet Swede, but by the man who had been his most vocal critic. Silas Croft, his voice filled with the fervor of a convert, described what he had seen inside Erickson's cabin. He told them about the barefoot children, about the shirt sleeves, about the dry, warm walls, and he told them about the woodpile. This was the part that silenced the scoffers. The numbers were the foundation of their lives. Every man knew, down to the last stick, how much wood it took to survive. When Silas told them that Johann had used less wood in 3 days of record-breaking cold than they used in a single mild winter afternoon, the mockery died. It was replaced by a stunned, calculating silence. The numbers were inarguable. They were a testament to a truth so profound it could not be ignored. That spring, a pilgrimage began to the Erickson homestead. It was led by Silas Croft. Men who had once pointed and laughed now came with hats in their hands, their questions quiet and respectful. They were not just asking how to build a cabin, they were asking how to build a better life. Johann, a man who never sought the spotlight, became an unlikely teacher. He did not lecture, he showed. He took them to his cooled charcoal mounds and explained the sifting process. He let them run the black dust through their fingers. He showed them the simple genius of the double wall. He answered their questions with the same plain, practical language he had always used. He shared his knowledge freely, without any sense of triumph or arrogance. He was simply a man helping his neighbors. The Erickson method, as it came to be known, began to transform the settlement. That summer, every new cabin was built with a 6-inch cavity in its walls. The demand for charcoal finds skyrocketed. Johann taught others the art of the kolmila, and soon the slow-burning mounds became a common sight in the woods. Erickson's folly had become the new standard. The following winter was the true test of the idea's adoption. When the cold returned, the difference was stark. The cabins built with charcoal walls consumed a fraction of the firewood. The air inside was drier, healthier. The oppressive, back-breaking labor of cutting wood was drastically reduced, freeing up time and energy for other tasks. But the real impact wasn't measured in cords of wood or degrees of temperature. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the sharp decline of winter coughs and sickness. It was measured in the babies who survived their first winter, kept safe in homes that were consistently warm. It was measured in the simple, profound dignity of a family able to move freely about their home without huddling around a stove, of children able to play on the floor without fear of the creeping, deadly chill. Johann Ericksson had not just built a warmer house. He had given his community the gift of a livable winter. The story of the charcoal-walled cabin is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the danger of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar. The wisdom of the community, represented by Silas Croft, was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. It was based on generations of experience with one set of materials and methods. Johann Ericsson's genius was not in inventing something entirely new, but in applying ancient, old-world knowledge to a problem in a new context. He understood a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that we still use today. His charcoal dust insulation is the direct ancestor of modern granulated and loose-fill insulation. The principle is the same. Trap millions of tiny pockets of air to stop the transfer of heat. The double wall he built is the forerunner of the modern cavity wall, a standard feature of construction worldwide. He was practicing advanced building science with the simple, humble materials he had at hand. This tale reminds us that innovation is often found at the margins, brought by outsiders who see the world through a different lens. It underscores the immense power of empirical evidence, of hard, undeniable numbers, and direct observation to overturn even the most deeply entrenched traditions. Did this story change how you think about old-school ingenuity? Hit that like button if it did, and subscribe for more forgotten wisdom from the frontiers of history. What is the most clever, low-tech solution to a problem you have ever encountered? Let me know in the comments below. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account, created to illustrate historical engineering principles in a narrative format. While the techniques of using charcoal as an insulator and desiccant in construction are based on real historical practices found in various cultures, the characters, specific events, and location are inventions for the purpose of this educational story. This content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional building or engineering advice.